When we imagine medieval life, we often picture castles, knights, and bustling markets. Yet, for the overwhelming majority of people in the Middle Ages, life was not measured in battles or tournaments, but in loaves of bread. Bread was more than just food. It was the daily anchor of existence, the most constant element of the medieval diet. For peasants and nobles alike, whether in a tiny village or a great walled city, bread was present from the first meal of the morning to the last supper at night. The kind of bread a person ate revealed their place in society. A peasant, in the 12th or 13th century, might sit down to a loaf that was heavy, coarse, and dark, made from rye, barley, or a mixture of grains that could be grown on poor soil. The bread was filling, sometimes sour, and often a little gritty, because the flour was ground in mills that let fragments of husk and stone slip into the dough. Nobles, by contrast, sought after bread made from finely sifted wheat flour. White bread, light and soft, was considered a mark of refinement. It was called manchet in England, and its pale color was a sign of privilege. The poor might see such bread at a feast day, but could rarely afford to taste it. Yet no matter what form it took, bread was essential. It was eaten at every meal, used to scoop up stews, dipped in broth, or even employed as a plate. In many households, thick slabs of stale bread, called trenchers, were set down and food piled upon them. At the end of the meal, the trenchers soaked through with meat juices and gravy were either eaten by the poorer guests or given away to beggars waiting at the door. In this way, bread was both food and vessel, both nourishment and symbol of charity. The process of making bread bound entire communities together. In many villages, peasants did not have private ovens. Building and maintaining one was too costly, and fire hazards were a constant concern. Instead, the lord of the manor or the village itself often maintained a communal oven. Families would knead their dough at home, shape the loaves, and then carry them in baskets to the oven to be baked with others. The smell of bread would rise above the settlement, comforting and familiar, a shared reminder that survival was tied to grain. Grain itself was life's most precious resource. Fields of wheat, barley, and rye determined whether a village would thrive or suffer. A good harvest meant full bellies and a measure of peace. A poor harvest could mean hunger, unrest, and even revolt. In some years, damp weather or blight ruined the crops, leading to shortages. Bread grew smaller, more expensive, and sometimes was adulterated with less desirable ingredients: beans, peas, acorns, or even sawdust mixed into flour to stretch it further. These loaves were harder, darker, and sometimes dangerous to health, but they filled a void when little else was available. Because of its central place in life, bread carried deep symbolic weight. In Christian Europe, bread was sacred. The Eucharist, the central ritual of the Church, involved the consecrated host bread transformed, in the belief of the faithful, into the body of Christ. To waste bread was considered not only unwise but sinful. To share bread was to share blessing. Even a crust dropped to the floor might be picked up, kissed, and placed aside with reverence. The rhythms of bread-making also set the pace of daily life. Grain was harvested in late summer, threshed in the autumn, ground into flour at mills, powered by water or wind, and then stored carefully against the cold months ahead. Women, who bore the main responsibility for food preparation in most peasant households, spent hours mixing, kneading, and tending dough. It was hard-work muscles straining to press and fold the heavy mass of flour and water, waiting for it to rise if yeast was available, and then carrying it to the oven. The act of making bread was laborious, yet it was also grounding, a task that connected one generation to the next. Not all bread was humble. In towns and cities, skilled bakers developed reputations for quality loaves, and guilds of bakers set rules about weight, price, and ingredients. A dishonest baker who sold bread that was too light or shortchanged customers could face harsh punishment, including being pilloried with his loaves around his neck. Bread was so vital that rulers issued laws to regulate it. In 1266, for example, England introduced the assize of bread and ale, which carefully controlled the weight and cost of bread according to the price of grain. Such laws reveal just how important bread was to society. It could not be left to chance. The variety of medieval bread was wider than we might think. Coarse Maslin bread, made of mixed grains, fed peasants daily. Flatbreads were common in some regions, especially where ovens were scarce. Rich households enjoyed spiced or sweetened breads on feast days, flavored with honey, nuts, or dried fruit. Monasteries, where monks followed ordered routines of work and prayer, often served bread as the basis of simple meals, though abbots and guests might receive finer loaves. Everywhere, bread was the thread running through the fabric of diet and devotion. Imagine, then, a winter's evening in a small English village around the year 1300. A family gathers in a timbered cottage with smoke curling from the central hearth. The father has returned from a day of labor in the fields. The mother has tended the children, and now the meal is laid out. A pot of pottage, thick with beans and cabbage, bubbling slowly over the fire. Beside it lies a round loaf of bread, coarse but warm. The family cuts slices, dipping them into the stew, chewing slowly as the warmth of both food and fire eases the cold from their bones. Outside, snow drifts across the thatched roofs, and the night deepens. Within, bread provides comfort. Across Europe, similar scenes unfolded again and again. In France, in Germany, in the Scandinavian lands, families relied on bread in its many forms to keep hunger at bay. It was the food of endurance, the daily companion, the humble miracle that turned simple grain into sustenance. Whether baked in a great castle's kitchen or a modest village oven, bread was the quiet foundation upon which medieval life stood. And so, as we think of what medieval people ate every day, it is bread that must come first to mind. Bread that carried the weight of survival. Bread that marked the line between feast and famine. Bread that connected neighbors and families. Bread that was both earthly and divine. It was not glamorous, but it was steady, dependable, and deeply human. And in its warmth and simplicity, medieval people found the strength to face the next day, and the day after that, through the long centuries of the Middle Ages. If bread was the foundation of medieval life, then porridge and stews were its steady companions. For peasants who formed the vast majority of Europe's population, meals were rarely lavish or filled with variety. Instead, they were humble, repetitive, and designed above all else to keep hunger at bay. To eat in the Middle Ages was not to indulge in endless delicacies, but to draw strength from whatever the land, the season, and the household's means could provide. And most often, that meant a simmering pot of pottage, the humble stew that fed generations. The word pottage may sound quaint now, but in the medieval period, it was spoken daily across Europe. It referred not to a single dish, but to a category of thick, soupy meals made from boiling grain, vegetables, and sometimes bits of meat together in a single pot. In an age before refrigeration, when food spoiled quickly and nothing could be wasted, pottage was both practical and nourishing. Each household made its own version depending on what was available. Sometimes it was rich and hearty. More often it was thin and plain. But it was the meal peasants returned to again and again. Imagine the scene in a small cottage. A rough clay pot hangs from a chain above the fire, its sides blackened by smoke. Inside, barley grains swell in the bubbling water. Carrots, leeks, and perhaps a few onions are stirred in. If fortune has smiled, a scrap of bacon bone or a bit of salted pork might be added for flavor, though such luxuries were not guaranteed. For most families, meat was scarce, and vegetables provided the bulk of daily nourishment. As the mixture simmers through the afternoon, the air fills with a warm, earthy aroma. When evening comes, each member of the family receives a ladle of the thickened stew, eaten with coarse bread. It is not glamorous, but it is filling, and it is life. The rhythm of meals was simple. Most peasants ate 2, sometimes 3, times a day. In the morning, a bowl of porridge, oats or barley boiled in water, sometimes flavored with a little milk, if a cow was producing offered the energy needed for the day's labor. At midday, workers in the fields might pause for a crust of bread and perhaps some cheese. The main meal came in the evening, when the family gathered at the hearth to share their pottage. In this way, the diet was repetitive but predictable, a steady cycle of grain-based meals designed to sustain. Vegetables formed the heart of peasant cooking. Cabbage, leeks, onions, carrots, and turnips were staples, planted in small household gardens, known as crofts. In summer, peasants ate them fresh, while in autumn they stored root vegetables in cellars or pits to last through winter. Herbs such as parsley, sage, and dill grew easily, and flavored dishes, offering small bursts of taste in otherwise plain fare. Garlic, too, was common, though it was considered a food of the lower classes. Wealthier households sought exotic spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves that traveled at great cost from the east, but peasants relied on what could be grown near home. Beans and legumes were another vital source of nourishment. Lentils, peas, and broad beans were boiled into stews, mashed into pastes, or eaten with bread. They provided protein where meat was scarce, and they could be dried and stored, ensuring food even in the harshest months. In fact, some historians have called the Middle Ages the Bean Age, so central were legumes to survival. They appeared in nearly every household pot, dependable and hardy, though sometimes mocked as the food of the poor. Meat, by contrast, was far less common. Hunting rights belonged to lords, and peasants who poached deer or wild boar risked severe punishment. Chickens, pigs, and sheep were raised in small numbers, but these animals were valuable assets, and most families could not afford to slaughter them often. A pig might be fattened for a single annual feast, its meat salted and preserved to stretch across months. Chickens were more useful for their eggs than their flesh, and so the taste of meat, while craved, was a rare experience for the majority. Instead, people found flavor in bones boiled for broth, or scraps saved for stews. In this landscape of scarcity, ingenuity mattered. Leftovers from one day's pottage often formed the base for the next. Grains thickened broths, and bread was dipped to soak up every last drop. Nothing was wasted. Even ale, the weak, fermented drink brewed in most households, was often added to cooking, giving body to stews. Dairy, too, played its part. When milk was available, it enriched porridge. When it soured, it could still be used in cooking. Cheese, hard and salty, was a reliable way to preserve milk and add flavor to otherwise bland meals. Seasonal changes shaped the diet profoundly. In spring, people ate the tender shoots of young greensnettles, spinach-like plants, and fresh herbs. Summer brought beans, peas, and fruits such as apples, cherries, and plums. Autumn meant harvest feasts, with grain newly milled and root vegetables stored away. But winter was harsh. Meals grew repetitive and thin, relying on whatever had been stored or salted. Cabbage, onions, and dried legumes dominated the pot. By late winter, stores ran low, leading to what was called the hungry gap, a lean season when people awaited the new growth of spring. This cycle of plenty and want shaped not only diet but culture. Feast days marked by the church offered rare opportunities for better food. A wedding, a saint's day, or a harvest celebration might bring roasted meat, fresh bread, and sweet treats made with honey. These occasions stood out all the more because daily fare was so modest. For most days of the year, the peasant diet remained unchanged, a steady reliance on pottage, porridge, and bread. And yet, there was comfort in this repetition. The thick warmth of pottage on a cold evening, the familiar taste of barley or oats boiled into porridge at dawn, the crack of crusty bread dipped into broth, these were the rhythms of life. They reminded peasants of continuity, of endurance, of the strength to carry on. Meals may have been humble, but they were shared, and in that sharing lay their deepest meaning. Around the hearth, families found not just sustenance but togetherness, a moment of peace after long hours of labor. So when we think of what medieval people really ate each day, we must look past the feasts of kings and the banquets of nobles. We must imagine instead the bubbling pot on the peasant hearth, the steam rising, the aroma of vegetables and grain, the steady ladling into wooden bowls. This was the diet of Europe, humble, repetitive, yet dependable, a diet that sustained millions through centuries of hardship. Porridge, stews, and the peasant's daily bread formed the quiet foundation of survival, a reminder that history is not only written in castles, but in cottages, in the simplest of meals, eaten together at the close of day. In the imagination of many, the Middle Ages conjure images of great banquets, long wooden tables laden with roasted boars, spiced fowl, and golden platters of fish, while lords and ladies feast in candlelight. Such scenes did exist, but they were rare, belonging to the upper reaches of society. For the ordinary peasant, meat was not a daily luxury, but an occasional treat, and fish, though more accessible, was often shaped as much by religious rule as by natural supply. To understand what medieval people really ate, we must step into this complex world of meat, fish, and fasting, where desire, survival, and devotion all intertwined. Meat was coveted, yet scarce. Most peasants could not afford to slaughter their animals often, for each beast represented a source of ongoing wealth. A cow provided milk, a sheep offered wool, chickens gave eggs, and pigs, though useful for meat, were usually fattened over months before being killed, often around Martinmas in November. That single slaughter became an event, the meat salted, smoked, or preserved to last through the winter. A family might live for months on pork prepared in this way. Small pieces added to pottage or stew to enrich flavor. Fresh meat was rare, reserved for feasts or celebrations, while preserved meat, though tougher and saltier, became the everyday companion of colder months. The rights to hunt wild animals further restricted access to meat. In most of Europe, forests, game, and even fish in certain rivers were legally the property of lords. A deer in the woods, or a wild boar, roaming the forest was not free for any hungry peasant to catch. To poach such animals was to risk harsh punishment, fines, imprisonment, or even mutilation. Thus, the forest, though full of life, was largely closed to those who needed it most. Instead, peasants relied on small animals they could raise themselves, a chicken for its eggs, a rabbit trapped quietly, or a goat for its milk and occasional meat. And yet, when meat did appear, it carried joy and meaning. A wedding feast might include roasted fowl, geese fattened for the occasion, or a suckling pig prepared to delight guests. At harvest festivals, when work was complete and the fields secured, villagers sometimes gathered to roast animals, turning the event into both celebration and thanksgiving. These occasions were remembered long after, treasured precisely because they broke the monotony of daily meals. If meat was scarce, fish offered another path, though not always by choice. The medieval church imposed strict rules about fasting, which meant abstaining from meat on many days throughout the year. Fridays were meatless, as were the weeks of Lent leading up to Easter, and other holy days that filled the calendar. In practice, this meant that almost half the year was lived without meat. The faithful turned instead to fish, eggs, dairy, and vegetables. For peasants already limited in their access to meat, fasting was less a dramatic sacrifice and more a continuation of their ordinary diet. But fish nevertheless became central to religious life. Fish came in many forms. Freshwater fish such as carp, pike, and eels were caught in rivers and ponds, though many waterways were also controlled by lords or monasteries. Monastic houses in particular developed elaborate systems of fish ponds, ensuring a steady supply for their communities during fast days. In coastal regions, peasants ate herring, cod, and shellfish, often dried, salted, or smoked to preserve them. Herring especially became a staple, traded across northern Europe in vast quantities. Salted herring was cheap, durable, and widely available, though its taste was far from luxurious. The process of preserving fish was essential. Without modern refrigeration, fresh fish spoiled quickly, especially inland. Salting and drying allowed it to be transported, though the flavor became strong and sometimes unpleasant. Yet for millions, it was a necessary substitute, meeting the church's demand for abstinence, while still providing nourishment. In wealthy households, fish might appear in more delicate forms: fresh salmon from rivers, sturgeon caught with effort, or exotic delicacies imported from distant coasts. But for peasants, it was the humble herring or eel that kept them in line with faith's expectations. The church's influence went deeper than simple rules of diet. Fasting was not merely about avoiding meat, but about discipline, humility, and penance. By giving up certain foods, the faithful trained their souls in endurance and sacrifice. This spiritual dimension meant that what people ate was tied directly to their beliefs, and meals became acts of devotion as much as sustenance. On fast days, a pot of pottage might be made with beans and vegetables instead of meat, perhaps with a salted fish flaked into the broth. In monasteries, where fasting rules were strict, elaborate vegetarian and fish-based recipes were developed, showing that even in abstinence, creativity thrived. Yet fasting could also blur into hunger. For the poor, who rarely ate much meat anyway, the church's restrictions added little change. But for the wealthy, it required real adjustment. Thus, kitchens in noble households invented intricate fish dishes, sometimes shaping them to mimic meat. Recipes survive describing fish molded into the form of a roast bird, or eels, spiced and baked to resemble pork. These were reminders of wealth's ability to soften even the demands of faith. The role of dairy and eggs within fasting rules was complex. In some periods and regions, they were forbidden during Lent, leading to creative substitutes. Almond milk, made from ground nuts and water, became a popular alternative, especially in monasteries and among the wealthy. For peasants, however, such luxuries were rare. They simply did without, enduring weeks of plain vegetable stews and bread until the Easter feast. when restrictions lifted and richer foods returned. Through all these practices, meat and fish became not just nourishment, but markers of rhythm. A piece of salted pork in winter, a platter of herring on a Friday, a roasted goose at Christmas Saul. These meals signaled the passing of time, the turning of seasons, and the cycles of faith. They connected people not only to their land and their lords, but to the spiritual calendar that ordered medieval life. Picture, if you will, a Friday evening in a small riverside village. The fields lie quiet after a day's labor. In one cottage, a pot of beans and onions simmers over the hearth, enriched not with meat, but with a few flakes of salted fish. The family gathers, dipping bread into the broth, chewing slowly in the dim glow of firelight. Outside, the river laps gently, its fish long since caught and salted for such a day. The meal is plain, but it is shared, and in its sharing, it becomes more than food. It is a rhythm, a ritual, a reminder of belonging. Thus, meat and fish in the medieval world were not simply matters of appetite. They were threads woven through economy, religion, and culture. Meat was rare but prized, a symbol of celebration and wealth. Fish was common but shaped by faith, binding daily life to the sacred calendar. And fasting, far from deprivation alone, gave structure and meaning to the act of eating. Together, they reveal how deeply food was tied, not only to survival, but to the spirit, making each meal in the Middle Ages a reflection of both body and soul. In the medieval world, where survival was measured by the harvest and the health of animals, dairy and eggs played an unassuming but essential role. They were not as glamorous as roasted meats or exotic spices, nor as constant as bread and pottage. Yet they provided nourishment, variety, and comfort in diets that could otherwise be monotonous. Alongside them, a host of forgotten flavors, wild herbs, regional plants, and humble seasonings gave medieval food its character, long before sugar and pepper became common in every kitchen. Let us begin with dairy, the quiet companion of daily life. A cow in the yard or a goat tethered near a cottage was not merely an animal but a source of ongoing wealth. Milk was too perishable to store for long, so it was used quickly, transformed into products that lasted. Butter, cream, and above all, cheese. These foods added richness to the peasant table, provided protein and fat, and could be stored in ways fresh milk could not. For children especially, milk was a precious resource, often drunk warm and fresh, though adults tended to view it as less suitable for grown stomachs. Butter, in particular, was beloved in Northern Europe, where the climate favored cattle. It was spread on coarse bread, melted into porridges, or used in cooking to add flavor and fat to otherwise lean meals. Cheese was even more significant. From soft fresh curds eaten within days to hard wheels that could last for months, cheese was a way to stretch the value of milk. Every household with access to cows, sheep, or goats made its own. In monasteries, cheese production was more organized, and monks became skilled cheesemakers, producing varieties that fed their communities and sometimes were sold to support their abbeys. Cheese appeared in many meals, grated into pottage, eaten with bread, or carried by workers into the fields as a portable, filling food. Some cheeses were plain and mild, others sharp and aged, depending on local custom. Today, the cheeses we enjoy are far more refined, but their roots lie in these humble medieval wheels, born of necessity and care. Eggs, too, were ever present. Chickens roamed freely in villages, scratching for grain and insects, their eggs collected daily. A steady supply of eggs meant reliable protein, and unlike meat, they did not require slaughtering the animal. Eggs were boiled, fried, or mixed into dishes, and in wealthier kitchens, they were used in more complex recipes, custards, pastries, and sauces. For peasants, eggs were simpler, a boiled egg in the morning, or beaten into pottage to thicken it. Children treasured them, and hens were valued not only for their eggs, but for the possibility of hatching more birds to keep the supply going. But eggs carried more than nourishment, they carried symbolism. They represented life, renewal, and fertility, and their presence at springtime festivals, especially Easter, reflected this meaning. In some places, eggs were dyed or decorated as part of celebrations, much as they are today. They also featured in religious fasting debates. Should eggs be allowed during Lent? At times they were forbidden, leading to the creative use of substitutes such as almond milk or flour-thickened broths. At other times they were permitted, reminding us that even humble eggs were caught up in the wider rhythms of faith and culture. Now, beyond dairy and eggs, there lies another world, the forgotten flavors of the medieval table. Today we take for granted the presence of sugar, pepper, and tomatoes, but in the Middle Ages, these were rare or unknown. Peasants flavored their food with what grew nearby: parsley, sage, thyme, dill, and mint. Garlic and onions were staples, giving depth to otherwise plain stews. Mustard seeds were ground into pastes to accompany meats, particularly in towns where mustard making became a craft. Vinegar, made from soured wine or ale, added sharpness to sauces and helped preserve food. These flavors were simple but powerful, shaping the character of daily meals. Salt, too, was vital not only for seasoning but for survival. Salt preserved meat and fish, carried flavor into bread, and was often a commodity of trade. Inland villages sometimes struggled to obtain it, while coastal communities with access to salt pans or trade routes fared better. The importance of salt in medieval life is reflected in language and law. It was valuable enough to spark disputes and shape economies. Honey was the primary sweetener, long before sugar was affordable. Beekeeping was common, with hives kept in woven skeps in gardens or fields. Honey sweetened porridge, enriched pastries, and preserved fruits in syrups. It also held medicinal value, applied to wounds or mixed with herbs in remedies. For peasants, honey was a rare luxury, but for monasteries and wealthier households, it was a treasured ingredient, linking sweetness with both festivity and healing. Many other flavors are now forgotten. Nettles, sorrel, and wild greens appeared in springtime soups. Roots like parsnips and turnips offered earthy sweetness in winter. Fruits were eaten fresh in summer, dried or preserved in autumn. Apples, pears, cherries, and plums grew in village orchards, and cider was often brewed from surplus fruit. Nuts, too, hazelnuts, walnuts, and chestnuts were collected, eaten raw, or ground into meals. In mountain regions, chestnuts even served as a staple food, ground into flour for bread. What is striking about these flavors is their locality. Each region ate what it could grow or gather, and taste was shaped by the land itself. A German peasant might rely more on cabbage and rye, while an English villager favored peas and barley. A southern French farmer used olive oil and herbs, while a northern French peasant leaned on butter and beans. To eat in the Middle Ages was to taste the soil, the climate, and the season, bound closely to one's surroundings, and yet there was joy in these simple tastes. A thick slice of bread spread with fresh butter, a boiled egg eaten with herbs, a wedge of sharp cheese after a long day of labor. These were not grand feasts, but they were moments of comfort. They reminded people that even in hardship, the land provided, and that food, however humble, was a gift. Picture, then, a small cottage in the springtime. The snows have melted, and the fields are greening. A pot simmers over the hearth, filled with nettles, onions, and a little barley. Beside it, a child gathers eggs from the chickens, their shells warm from the nest. The mother beats one egg into the pottage, thickening it, while another is boiled for the father returning from the fields. On the table lies a wheel of cheese, cut carefully to make it last. The family eats together, savoring the freshness of spring after the lean winter months. The meal is plain, yet it is filled with gratitude and renewal. Thus, dairy, eggs, and forgotten flavors remind us of the quiet richness of medieval diets. They were not luxuries, but they were essential, providing variety, nourishment, and a connection to both land and season. They carried symbolism, to life in the egg, sweetness in the honey, strength in the cheese, and they reveal that even in an age of scarcity, food could still be joyful, flavorful, and deeply meaningful. If daily meals in the Middle Ages were humble and repetitive, the times of celebration shone all the brighter. For peasants and nobles alike, feast days, weddings, and holy festivals broke the monotony of porridge and pottage. They offered not only rare foods, but moments of joy, community, and relief from hardship. Alongside these occasions, drinks ale, cider, mead, and, for the wealthy, wine were ever present, sustaining people in daily life and adding merriment to special events. To understand medieval eating fully, we must explore not only what was eaten every day, but what was shared when the village gathered, the bells rang, and the hearths blazed with festivity. Let us begin with drink, for in many ways it was as central as bread. Water was not always trusted. Though it was drunk, particularly in rural areas, it was often drawn from streams or wells that could be easily fouled. Ale, therefore, became the most common beverage, consumed daily by peasants, children included, but this was not the strong ale we imagine today. It was small ale, weak in alcohol, brewed quickly from malted grain, and intended to be drunk fresh. Its mild fermentation killed harmful bacteria, making it safer than water, while its calories offered a small but steady boost of nourishment. Each household often brewed its own ale, women taking charge of the work, and the smell of malt and hops drifted through village lanes. Ale was more than refreshment. It was a social bond. Neighbors visited one another to drink, and alehouses became centers of local life. Taxes and regulations were often imposed on its sale, reminding us of its importance. In regions where apples grew in abundance, cider also found its place, pressed and fermented to a sweet, sharp drink. Mead, made from honey, was rarer, but when available it was treasured, linking drink to the work of bees and the sweetness of summer. Wine, by contrast, belonged mostly to the wealthy and to regions where vineyards thrived. It was imported into northern lands at great expense, filling the goblets of nobles and clergy, but it was rarely seen on the peasant table. With drink came feasts, those rare occasions when the ordinary gave way to abundance. The medieval year was punctuated with holy days: Christmas, Easter, Saints' Days, and with the cycles of agriculture: planting in spring, harvest in autumn. On these days, food was prepared in quantities impossible during ordinary times. A goose might be roasted, a pig slaughtered, bread baked from the best flour. Vegetables and fruits were served in greater variety, and, when possible, sweet dishes made with honey delighted children and adults alike. Harvest festivals were among the most joyous. After the fields had been cleared and the grain stored, the community celebrated. Ale flowed, songs were sung, and tables groaned under platters of food. Even the poorest received more than usual, for these were days when lords sometimes distributed food in gratitude for the labor of their tenants. It was a time of relief, for the work was done, the stores were full, and the spectre of hunger held at bay, at least for a while. Weddings, too, brought feasts. A marriage joined not only to people but to families, sometimes even to villages. Guests gathered, bringing gifts of food, bread, ale, cheese, or meat, to add to the table. The celebration might last a full day, or longer, with dancing, music, and laughter filling the air. Such occasions were remembered for years, for they offered moments when the hardships of daily toil were set aside, and joy could be shared. The church, ever present in medieval life, also shaped feasting. Saints' days were observed with special meals, and monasteries often hosted travelers and the poor with generous hospitality. On certain holy days, fasting gave way to feasting, the lifting of restrictions allowing for richer foods and drink. Easter, in particular, was marked by abundance. After the long fast of Lent, tables once again held eggs, dairy, and meat, symbols of renewed life and blessing. Feasting also carried symbolism. To share food in abundance was to show generosity, to reinforce bonds of community and loyalty. Lords were expected to provide for their tenants on certain occasions, not only as charity but as a sign of their authority and care. Monasteries, too, gained reputation for their hospitality. Their refectories filled not only with monks but with guests, pilgrims, and the poor. Food at such gatherings was never just sustenance, it was a language of power, faith, and fellowship. Yet even within feasting, class distinctions remained visible. At a noble's banquet, the dishes were elaborate. Roasted swans or peacocks presented with their feathers, spiced sauces poured over meats, sugar confections sculpted into shapes of castles or animals. Exotic spices, pepper, cinnamon, saffron perfumed the air, their expense signaling wealth. Minstrels played, jugglers entertained, and the hall shone with candlelight. In contrast, a peasant wedding or harvest feast was simpler. A pig roasted whole, large loaves of bread, thick pottages with extra beans or meat, apples and nuts for dessert. There was singing and dancing too, but the richness was measured more in company than in culinary extravagance. Still, For peasants, these simpler feasts were no less joyous. After months of eating the same humble meals, to taste roast meat, to drink freely of ale, to dance under the stars, this was celebration enough. Children laughed, neighbors told stories, and old songs were sung around the fire. The memory of such days lingered, giving strength in the long months of labor that followed. Drinks, too, flowed more freely at feasts. Alehouses brewed stronger batches, and for the wealthy, wine was imported in greater quantity. Mead, when available, was passed around in cups, its sweetness a luxury. In some regions, special spiced drinks were made, blending herbs, honey, and warm wine. To drink together was to seal fellowship, to confirm friendship, to bind community. It was not only about intoxication, but about ritual and belonging. Imagine, for a moment, a winter feast at Christmas. Snow lies deep outside, the fields barren and silent. In the village hall, a fire roars, and trestle tables are set with loaves of fresh bread, trenchers piled with roasted pork, pots of cabbage and beans. Ale flows from pitchers, laughter echoes, and children play at the edges of the crowd. The priest offers blessings, reminding all of the holy day, and then the music begins. For one night, hunger is forgotten, warmth is shared, and joy binds the community. Such scenes remind us that medieval food was not only about survival, it was about rhythm, about marking time, about lifting the spirit. Daily meals might have been repetitive, but feasts gave them meaning, just as fasts gave feasts their power. Drinks nourished the body and enlivened the spirit, binding people together in fellowship. To eat and drink was to live, but to feast was to celebrate life itself, with all its hardship and all its fleeting joy. When we look back at the Middle Ages, it is tempting to focus on feasts, castles, and bustling markets. But for most people, the shadow that shaped daily life was hunger. Not the mild hunger we might feel when we delay a meal, but the deep, gnawing uncertainty of whether food would be enough to last the winter, whether the harvest would come in strong, or whether disease or war would steal away what little the earth had given. Hunger was a constant companion in medieval life. It sat at the table in poor cottages, crept into villages during harsh winters, and swept through whole regions during years of famine. For peasants, whose lives depended almost entirely on the soil they worked, survival was fragile. A good harvest meant security, but one season of bad weather could spell disaster. Crops were vulnerable to rain, frost, and blight. Grain rotted if stored poorly. A plague among livestock could rob a family of milk, meat, and labor. Even in good years, supplies were carefully measured, rationed to last until the next harvest. And yet, there was always the dreaded time known as the hungry gap. The hungry gap came in late winter and early spring, when the stores from the previous harvest dwindled, and the new growth of crops had not yet matured. Grain bins were nearly empty, root vegetables shriveled in their pits, and dried legumes were counted carefully to make them last. Meals became smaller, thinner, and more repetitive. Pottage, once thick with vegetables in summer, became little more than watery broth with a few scraps of cabbage or onion. Families ate bread more sparingly, cutting loaves thinner, sometimes substituting with less desirable grains. Hunger was sharpest during these months, when labor in the fields was needed to prepare for spring planting. But food was scarcest. In such times, people turned to what we might call famine foods. These were not the foods they preferred, but the foods that could keep them alive when little else remained. Acorns, usually food for pigs, were sometimes ground into meal and mixed with barley to make bread. The result was bitter and heavy, but it filled the stomach. Bark from trees could be dried, ground, and blended into flour, producing what was sometimes called famine bread. Nettles and wild greens, gathered from hedgerows, were boiled into thin soups. Roots such as parsnips and turnips, though tough and fibrous, became staples when grain ran out. Even the shells of peas and beans might be boiled again to draw out every last bit of nourishment. It is important to remember that famine was not rare. In some regions of Europe, a poor harvest struck every decade or so, and sometimes disasters came in waves. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was among the most devastating. Relentless rain ruined crops across northern Europe. Fields turned to mud, grain sprouted and rotted before it could be harvested, and hay for animals spoiled in the wet. Livestock starved or died of disease, leaving people without meat, milk, or draft power. Bread prices soared beyond the reach of peasants. Chroniclers of the time wrote of desperation. people eating cats, dogs, even the bark from trees. Parents, it was whispered, abandoned children they could not feed. Corpses lined the roadsides in some regions, a grim testimony to the fragility of life. Famine did not only cause immediate suffering, it weakened entire populations, making them vulnerable to disease. Malnourished bodies could not resist infection, and epidemics followed hunger like a shadow. Just a few decades after the Great Famine, Europe was struck by the Black Death, and historians believe that the weakened state of many communities made them all the more susceptible to the plague's devastating impact. Hunger and disease together created cycles of suffering that shaped entire generations. And yet, people endured. They survived not only through endurance but through ingenuity. Preservation techniques became critical. Meat, when it was available, was salted or smoked to last through the winter. Fish were dried, salted, or pickled. Grain was stored carefully in bins, sometimes lined with straw to protect it from damp. Cheese, hard and long-lasting, provided nourishment when milk was unavailable. Even ale and cider played a role, offering calories and safe hydration when water supplies were unreliable. These methods of preservation were not perfect. Spillage was always a threat, but they extended survival in the lean months. Community support also mattered, though medieval society was stratified, with clear distinctions between lord and peasant. There was also recognition that hunger could destabilize entire regions. Lords sometimes distributed food during famine years, not only from charity but from necessity. Hungry peasants could not work, and desperate subjects might rebel. Monasteries, too, played a role, their granaries feeding the poor in times of need. Parish churches collected alms to help those in want, and neighbors shared what little they had when times grew hard. These gestures did not erase hunger, but they sometimes meant the difference between survival and death. Hunger also shaped the culture of food. Recipes and traditions developed around stretching ingredients as far as possible. Pottage was endlessly adaptable. If beans were scarce, more cabbage was added. If meat was unavailable, herbs and onions gave flavor. Bread was bulked with cheaper grains like rye, oats, or peas. Soups were reheated and added to day after day, creating what some called perpetual stew, a pot that was never truly empty. Waste was unthinkable. Bones were boiled for broth, fat was rendered for cooking, and scraps were fed to animals. Even ashes from the hearth could be used to make lye for preserving foods or making soap, indirectly supporting survival. The psychology of hunger was as important as its physical toll. Chroniclers wrote of the despair that fell upon villagers during famine years. Songs and prayers turned to pleas for mercy, asking God to deliver abundance once more. Festivals and rituals developed around food, marking its central role in life. Harvest celebrations were not only about plenty, but about relief. The fear of hunger had been lifted, at least for a season. Even the language of religion was steeped in food, bread as the body of Christ. Feasts as glimpses of heaven, reflecting the deep connection between nourishment and the soul. Survival tricks varied from place to place. In Scandinavia, people turned to fish from the sea and lakes, often dried or salted to carry them through long winters. In mountainous regions, chestnuts were ground into flour and baked into bread, forming the backbone of survival when grain was scarce. In the British Isles, oats became essential, boiled into porridge or baked into oatcakes that kept for days. In parts of Eastern Europe, fermented cabbage, what we now call sauerkraut, was an important source of vitamins during the winter months. These regional variations remind us that medieval people were resourceful, finding nourishment wherever it could be wrested, from land or water. Despite this resourcefulness, famine left scars. Children who grew up during famine years often bore the marks of malnutrition in their body's shorter stature, weaker health. Families lost members, villages lost laborers, and entire regions could decline for decades. Hunger was not only a personal trial, but a social and economic wound. Yet, it also forged resilience. People learned to endure, to adapt, to pass down knowledge of what could be eaten in desperation. Generations remembered which roots were edible, how to leach bitterness from acorns, how to dry fish or preserve grain against damp. These memories became part of the culture, shaping the wisdom of survival. To imagine the reality of medieval hunger, let us picture a village in the late winter of a poor harvest year. Snow still covers the ground, and the fields lie empty, waiting for spring. Inside a cottage, a family gathers around a pot that hangs over a weak fire. Into the pot, have gone the last shriveled turnips, a handful of dried beans, and a few leaves of cabbage, long stored and fading. The broth is thin, but each member takes a small bowl, savoring what little warmth it provides. Bread, once plentiful after harvest, is nearly gone, and the loaves now are small, cut into the thinnest of slices. Outside, neighbors face the same struggle, their children growing thin, their animals weak. Rumors of grain arriving from another region spread, but no one knows if it will reach them. Still, the family eats together, clinging to hope that spring will bring relief. Such scenes were not rare. They were the reality of life for millions, repeated across centuries. And yet, people endured. They found ways to survive, to carry on, to pass through the hunger and reach again the seasons of abundance. Their resilience shaped the very fabric of medieval society, reminding us that history is not only the story of kings and battles, but of ordinary people facing the most elemental challenge: how to eat, how to live, how to carry on when hunger pressed close. In the end, hunger was both enemy and teacher. It revealed the fragility of life, but also the strength of community. It pushed people to innovate, to preserve, to remember the value of every grain and every loaf. It infused culture with rituals of feast and fast, with prayers for daily bread, with gratitude for every harvest. And it is perhaps here that we find the deepest truth of medieval food, that beyond bread, pottage, meat, fish, dairy, and drink, the most enduring taste was not of abundance, but of endurance,